Hello everybody, this is Rob of Rule of Two Review. Welcome back to the channel. I hope you're having a great day. And today, I thought I would do things a little bit differently, and I'm going to talk about Metroid. So, naturally, we are all laser focused on Metroid Prime 4 Beyond. We are still being told the game is releasing this year in 2025, and I want to believe them, so let's all cross our fingers and hope that we don't get shocked with a sudden delay of Metroid Prime 4 into 2026. And so it's a very exciting time for Metroid superfans like myself, and I think for most Nintendo fans and game fans, who just know and recognize Metroid as one of the oldest franchises in the industry, and one of the most highly regarded. And the past few weeks have been a great time to be a Metroid fan because we've been getting overloaded with new information, new trailers, new gameplay, and all sorts of great stuff around the franchise and around Metroid Prime 4 to keep us excited. And this goes back to the March 27th Nintendo Direct that was focused on the Switch 1, because that's where we got that new 3-minute trailer that introduced us to a couple of really huge details. I think the key ones being the location of Planet Vuros as the main area we're going to actually be exploring in the game, as well as the introduction of the psychic abilities. And then, of course, beyond that was that incredible treehouse footage, 17 minutes of uninterrupted, gorgeous 4K Nintendo Switch 2 gameplay. Of course, the Switch 2 being another big piece of news from the last few weeks, right? Just the confirmation that Metroid Prime 4 is going to be a cross-generation game. There is a Switch 2 version with significantly upgraded graphics and performance and all of that great stuff for the Switch 2. It's such an exciting time, and I am just living for it, man. But, of course, I think that through all of our excitement for Metroid Prime 4 Beyond, there is something nagging in the back of our brains, right? And what that is the missing Metroid Prime 2 and Metroid Prime 3. Because, of course, 2 years ago now, which is crazy to think about, but 2 years ago, in February of 2023, Metroid Prime Remastered was dropped upon the world, shocked us, blew our minds, and was an incredible re-release and remaster, and in some ways kind of a remake, of one of the most famous and most popular games of all time, and my personal favorite game of all time. So, we have Metroid Prime 1 that got a re-release on the Nintendo Switch and will be playable on the Switch and the Switch 2, because of course the Switch 2 is backwards compatible. We've got Metroid Prime 4 Beyond coming, but we're missing the middle two chapters, right? Metroid Primes 2 and 3. People have been asking for these for a very long time. This even dates back to when we were all asking for the Metroid Prime trilogy to get just an HD re-release on the Nintendo Switch before we ever saw Metroid Prime Remastered. And so, the big question we all still have, and there were rumors about this, and Jeff Grubb very vocally talked about, you know, there's a remake of Prime 1, and then there are HD ports of Prime 2 and 3 coming, and we got the Prime 1 remake, essentially, so he was right about that. Prime 2 and 3 are still a mystery, and so people continue to ask about Metroid Primes 2 and 3, and I wanted to weigh in. Now that we're in this Switch 2 era and the Metroid Prime 4 Beyond era, because it was only less than a year ago, we still didn't even know anything about Metroid Prime 4. Even the title of Beyond, right? All of that stuff was still a mystery a year ago. So we're in the Switch 2 and the Metroid Prime 4 era. I wanted to weigh in a little bit more about how important or not important it might actually be for Nintendo to even re-release Primes 2 and 3 before Metroid Prime 4. So let me be crystal clear as day about my opinions on this part of it. I want, almost more than I want breath in my lungs, I want Primes 2 and 3 to get a re-release on the Switch and on the Switch 2 and whatever it is that they might do. Especially looking at Prime Remastered, which made my all-time #1 favorite game look and play better than it ever has before. It exceeded expectations wildly. And so when I imagine Primes 2 and 3, two games that I also love and are damn near masterpieces to me as well, I picture those two games getting similar treatment to Metroid Prime Remastered, and it just makes my mouth drool at the prospect, man. It would be so incredible. And yes, it would also be, I think, beneficial to the Metroid franchise, to the Metroid fandom, and very likely to Metroid Prime 4 in a lot of ways as well, for them to re-release those games before Beyond comes out. And so the crux of a lot of people's argument for why 2 and 3 should come out now as opposed to later or even never is that, in theory, giving newcomers the opportunity to play the entire Prime trilogy easily on modern hardware, not go and buy a GameCube and a Wii and buy the original copies because that's all very expensive. Prime 1 is already available, so you release Primes 2 and 3, you give all the newcomers an opportunity to play the trilogy leading into Prime 4, so that people feel caught up with the games and the gameplay, they feel caught up with the story and the lore and Samus's journey up to Metroid Prime 4, so that Metroid Prime 4 doesn't feel like an intimidating game to jump into. Because they did leave the number 4 as a part of the title, which I love and I think is the right call, but I understand the argument that people who've never played the Prime games, or if they've only played Prime Remastered, but they didn't get a chance to play 2 and 3, that maybe they're going to be too intimidated to jump into Metroid Prime 4 because, well, I've played number 1, and I could play number 4, but I'm missing 2 and 3. It's an extremely valid point. And like I already said, in a perfect world, Nintendo does release 2 and 3 in some fashion. Whether they're just HD ports, or if they get the remastered treatment, that's something more impressive than just a standard port or whatever. Obviously, I want that, and they should do that, and I even still think they might do that. But the games continue to be a mystery, and so I wanted to discuss why, as much as it would be great for them to do that, I actually don't think it's as pivotal as a lot of other people think. There are a few reasons why I believe this, and I understand it might even be a little bit surprising to a lot of folks to hear me, of all people, say that Nintendo doesn't need to release Primes 2 and 3 before Prime 4 releases for newcomers, but you gotta hear me out here. First, I have to say that there is no doubt in my mind that Metroid Prime 4 will open with some sort of catch-up or prologue that will prepare newcomers to jump into the story at the 4th game and catch them up with all of the events and all the necessary information from Primes 1, 2, and 3. The perfect example and the perfect template already exists. Look at Metroid Dread. Metroid Dread was Metroid 5, so it's already skipping over Metroids 1 through 4 as well as the events of Metroid Other M, and it just drops all of the 3 million, well, not all 3 million were newcomers, but it drops 3 million people bought and played that game, more than 3 million, and it dropped the huge volume of newcomers to the Metroid franchise that started with Metroid Dread. I'll say it that way. The huge volume of newcomers that started with Dread, it caught them up to speed. It opened up with a really great prologue that kind of recapped a lot of the events of the prior games, mostly focusing on Fusion, because it's important to know Fusion to lead into Metroid Dread, and I think they did a great job. And trust me, as somebody who runs a significantly dedicated Metroid channel, I've heard from a lot of people in the years since Metroid Dread release that it was their first game and they loved it. They weren't afraid to jump in with Metroid Dread. They weren't confused at the story. The setup that the game opens with that catches you up to speed clearly worked for almost every single newcomer who's played only Metroid Dread. So I'd have to think that Nintendo and Retro are smart enough to know that they can do the same thing for Prime 4. I think we all trust Retro Studios to do it the right way. So I think that alone is going to work in Metroid Prime 4's favor. It also has to be said, and I've touched on this in years past when discussing the Metroid franchise, and specifically the Prime games, and back when Prime 4 was still a mystery for the last 7 or 8 years that I've been talking about Prime 4 with literally no information. Something that I personally do believe, as a Metroid superfan who loves all of the lore and Samus and the story and the events and everything about it, and I know it all so very well, I actually believe that the Metroid franchise doesn't really rely as much on actual story as it does lore, right? So yes, there are narrative beats that are very important in all of the games to understand Samus's journey and the story being told and her role within the Galactic Federation and her plight against Ridley as a recurring threat, and how Ridley killed her parents when she was young. So whether you're talking about the 2D games or the Prime series, there are narrative beats that are important that the games do certainly give us. However, it's not really about a story in the truest sense of the word. Not in the same way that the Legend of Zelda series has a story, and not in the same way that more narrative-focused games, like, I don't know, we'll say The Last of Us, for example, something like that, or Final Fantasy, those games rely on such a specific story that is very dialogue and character-driven, and that is not the Metroid franchise, you guys. That is not Samus. You know, Samus really doesn't have a lot to say, I'll say, in a lot of the games. She is present, she is our conduit through experiencing the story, and experiencing the adventures, I should say. And obviously with a few exceptions, Metroid Other M being the biggest one, and Fusion, of course, has some of this as well. It's really less about Samus and more about the adventure. Even though we know Samus, we care about her, we learn some of her history and her relation to Metroids as a force and an entity, and then eventually the X-Parasite. This is a long way for me to say that you don't need to know the story and the big narrative beats in the Metroid franchise the same way you do for a lot of other story-based series. And so all of that is to say that one of the things that works in the Metroid franchise's favor is that while it helps to know more games than not, and while it helps to know these important pieces of lore and history of Samus and Ridley and the Space Pirates and the Metroids and the X-Parasite and all this stuff, you can very easily jump into almost any game in the series and pretty much be fine, especially if they give you some sort of prologue that catches you up in some way, shape, or form. Part of the reason I think that is because the franchise goes back to the NES. I mean, you look at the little bits of story that Metroid 2 on the Game Boy and Super Metroid give you in the beginning and ending of those games. That's the 8 and the 16-bit era of storytelling. You get a couple of still images with some text, and that's all you need to know, you know? The last Metroid is in captivity. The galaxy is at peace. Like, all you need to know is those couple of things. That's like the foundational storytelling to a franchise as old as Metroid. And so that's why I think with Metroid Dread, they were able to just catch it. Because the last game before Metroid Dread was Fusion on the Game Boy Advance in 2002, okay? So 2D side-scrolling storytelling in 2002 was still very simple. And so Metroid Dread could get away with just, you know, the 5-minute opening kind of cutscene with some text to catch you up with Samus's journey up until that point. And Metroid Prime, obviously, is a lot more cinematic than the 2D games, and so they would have to do a little bit more of a cinematic prologue, I think, for Metroid Prime 4. But they could do it without releasing Primes 2 and 3. That's what this whole long rant is about, is that they don't need 2 and 3 to catch people up to Metroid Prime 4. In fact, another pivotal element to this that we can't forget is that the trilogy itself, Metroid Primes 1, 2, and 3, really did kind of conclude a very specific narrative being told. I mean, the story between Metroid Prime as an entity, the Space Pirates, Phazon, Dark Samus as a representation of Metroid Prime itself and as a main kind of antagonizing force opposing Samus, in most ways that did conclude. You could even say in all ways it did conclude. Now, I have long said, over the many, many years since Metroid Prime 4 was announced, that it's not impossible for the writers of the story to find a way to reintroduce Dark Samus and Metroid Prime and maybe continue a lot of the same plot threads that were dropped in the Prime trilogy. And at some point before Prime 4 comes out, I do plan to make a video kind of recapping that and explaining how maybe they could do that. But knowing that Sylux is going to play a very important part to Metroid Prime 4, maybe even the most important part, that obviously does introduce the possibility of an entirely new story still under the Metroid Prime banner of games being introduced. And so, even though the number 4 is in the title, they could also treat this game as a bit of a soft reboot in terms of the story. For as much as I'm talking about how the story, quote-unquote, isn't the most important part to the Metroid franchise, it's present enough that you could say Prime 3 concluded that part of the story, and Prime 4 could be the beginning of a new part of the story, or a new chapter in the Prime saga and for Samus's journey. Again, partly because of the end of Dark Samus and the reintroduction of Sylux into this game. So it's really important that we consider that in terms of new players jumping in without playing Primes 1, 2, and 3. And so this brings me to the last point, which is I also have to wonder if Nintendo is a little bit concerned with overwhelming players with too much Metroid Prime before Prime 4 comes out, right? And if you know the Prime games, like you probably do, most of you guys I know who watch me and watch my Metroid videos, you already know the franchise, you know these games. Think about it. The Prime games are very long, they're very involved, especially Prime 2. There's a lot of game and a lot of time commitment to catch up. If one was to say, I'm interested in Metroid Prime 4, but I've never played the Prime games, if they were to look at the amount of content to play Primes 1, 2, and 3 before they play Prime 4, a lot of people would and could do it, but a lot of people would be, I think, intimidated just by that. It's a lot of game to catch up on before playing Metroid Prime 4. And I feel like with Prime Remastered already out, if Nintendo was to release Primes 2 and 3, a lot of people would suddenly feel even more obligated to play those games before playing Metroid Prime 4, and I bet that there's a chance a lot of people might try to do that. They might try to catch up on Primes 1, 2, and 3 before Beyond comes out, and maybe even not so much give up, but realize that, like, man, this is a lot. Maybe they make it all the way through Prime Remastered and then part of the way through Prime 2 before, like, needing to move on. They might need a break from Metroid Prime, you know? I guess I can't speak for everybody, but for me, I can't necessarily always do that with a game series and just play game after game after game of something that I've never played before and just do it until I've completed the series. Like, sometimes you need a break and you need variety. And I feel like if Metroid Primes 2 and 3 came out soon and people wanted to catch up before Prime 4, they might get overwhelmed. They might put 2 or 3 aside, not complete those games, so that by the time Prime 4 comes out, they might say, geez, well, I started Metroid Prime 2, but I never finished it, and it's good, but I took a break, and now Prime 4 is out, and I'm not going to pick that up because I never even finished 2 and 3. And so it's a long way for me to say that maybe Nintendo realizes it's smart. Prime Remastered's already out. Let Prime 4 come out. No one is going to feel the obligation to play the whole trilogy beforehand. They'll play Prime 4. They'll love Prime 4. And then maybe they'll go back and play Primes 2 and 3 later, which is why I think maybe they release them after Metroid Prime 4. I understand that there's a case to be made for how Nintendo treated the Pikmin franchise, because when Pikmin 4 was coming out on the Nintendo Switch last year, or actually, oh my gosh, was that 2 years ago now? I think that was 2023. Holy smokes. So when Pikmin 4 was coming out in 2023, you know, Pikmin 3 had already gotten the deluxe port from the Wii U like a few years beforehand. But what about Pikmin's 1 and 2? Well, Nintendo, before Pikmin 4 released, I believe, they did release a Pikmin 1 and 2 HD port re-release, like a physical and a digital release of Pikmin's 1 and 2 in HD, which was really great, so that they could say, look, the first 3 Pikmin games are already now playable on the Switch, and you can play these before you play Pikmin 4. And that was great, and I love the Pikmin franchise. Pikmin's 3 and 4 just absolutely blew me away. I love them both so much. But I feel like for everything I said about the Metroid series not being so reliant on the story, Pikmin is even less reliant on that stuff if you really think about it. So I don't see Pikmin, which is one of my favorite franchises, by the way, so this is not me cherry picking. I think that Pikmin, it's a little bit easier for people to not feel intimidated by jumping into a lot of Pikmin games at once, whereas with the Metroid Prime franchise, there's just so much more game. You know, I guess that's the only phrasing and verbiage I can think to explain this. There's a lot more game to the full Metroid Prime saga than there is to the 4 Pikmin games, right? And again, saying that as a massive Pikmin fan who will defend that franchise to the ends of the earth. I love Pikmin. But I don't think it's the same kind of intimidating experience as it is jumping into 4 Metroid Prime games, because they're just so epic and grand in scope. So this turned out to be a much longer conversation and presentation of my thoughts on this concept than I anticipated, but I've been thinking about this for a good long while. pretty much since we saw Metroid Prime 4 Beyond revealed officially last year in the June Nintendo Direct, right? The first time we saw the game. I've been thinking like, okay, we've been missing Primes 2 and 3, and now we see Prime 4. We see the gameplay. It's got a title. It's called Beyond. They're telling us it's coming out in 2025. What about Primes 2 and 3? Blah, blah, blah. And I've been thinking about that, and it's like, look, man, I feel like there's a chance of overwhelming the new coming audience. Us who have already played the games, we would happily jump into Primes 2 and 3 remastered before Prime 4. But I think that newcomers might feel so obligated to play those games before 4 that it might overwhelm them. I've said it 100 times in this video, and I'm repeating my points at this point so I can wrap it up here, but hopefully you guys understand what I'm saying. I advocate for them doing it. They should do it. I want them to do it, but I can see the benefit to them waiting. And I think that eventually they will release them. Okay, that's my ultimate thesis here. But something tells me that they might wait till after Metroid Prime 4 comes out. So all these new fans are birthed out of the experience of Metroid Prime 4. Then they release 2 and 3, and more people will be interested in buying those games after Prime 4 than beforehand. Just speculating, just spitballing as a Metroid superfan, but these are my thoughts and opinions. Talk about it below. Tell me if you agree or disagree with my theories. There's no right or wrong way to feel. I don't even know what's right or wrong. This is just me, like I said, riffing about this. So share your thoughts below. Thanks, of course, for tuning in, guys, and I will see you next time.